The wind screamed through the dense pines that surrounded Redwood State Penitentiary, a maximum security prison carved into the edge of Oregon's wilderness. The forest pressed in from every side, but inside those cold, gray walls, the silence felt even heavier. Calvin Briggs had been locked up for nearly 24 years. Inmates came and went, warden names changed, but Calvin remained. A ghost of a man who had once worn a soldier's uniform and commanded respect with his presence. Before the prison bars, before the silence, there had been fire. Calvin Briggs had served 2 tours in Iraq, rising to the rank of staff sergeant. He was a disciplined soldier, decorated for bravery, known for following orders with brutal precision. But when he returned home, something in him didn't. The war had altered the wiring in his mind. Everything felt too loud or too hollow, too threatening or too meaningless. Civilian life had no chain of command, no code, no control. And Calvin, without structure, unraveled. The incident that landed him behind bars wasn't a clean-cut bar fight or a moment of petty anger. It was an explosion. A neighbor had made a lewd comment about Tyler's mother, long after their divorce, and Calvin reacted like a man still on the battlefield. He waited outside that man's garage with a steel pipe and shattered every bone in his legs. The prosecutors called it attempted murder. Calvin called it honor. The judge called it irreversible. He was sentenced to 30 years with no parole until year 25. Tyler had been just 9 years old. And while the world moved forward, Calvin remained frozen in the same warped frame of justice that had both shaped and destroyed him. Now, he barely spoke to anyone unless he had to. He kept his bed made tight, read outdated military novels, and counted his steps in the yard. His days were predictable, deliberate, and deeply isolated, exactly how he wanted them. That is, until a letter arrived. It came in the late afternoon mail call, tucked between a legal newsletter and a commissary invoice. Calvin recognized the handwriting before he even saw the return address. Tyler Briggs, his son. He stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. "Hey, Dad. Hope you're doing all right. I've got big news. I met someone. Her name is Savannah. She's amazing, kind, smart, passionate about helping people. We're engaged. I'd really love for you to meet her." The letter continued with details about their small apartment near Portland, Savannah's work in public health, and how they'd been planning a simple ceremony in the spring. There was a quiet excitement in Tyler's words, a sense of normalcy that Calvin hadn't felt in years. And it unnerved him. Calvin folded the letter slowly, set it on his bunk, and leaned back against the concrete wall. He hadn't seen his son in nearly a decade. Their relationship had been strained long before prison bars separated them. But now, Tyler was reaching out. He wanted Calvin to meet this woman, his future wife. Calvin didn't believe in fairy tales. Life didn't hand you happy endings wrapped in ribbon. Still, the thought of seeing his son after so long and meeting the woman who now held his future cracked open something Calvin had sealed shut. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or a warning. The visit was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. That morning, the prison was quiet under a curtain of fog. Calvin dressed in the pressed beige uniform provided by the facility. His hair, now silver at the temples, was combed back neatly. He shaved carefully, not for vanity, but for control. Routine mattered. At exactly 1:45 p.m., a guard escorted him to the visitation wing. A large room lined with dull metal tables bolted to the floor and plastic chairs worn down by years of use. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A vending machine buzzed uselessly in the corner. Calvin waited at table 6. His fingers were laced tightly in front of him, expression unreadable. But inside, his pulse was quickening. The door opened. First came Tyler, older, broader than Calvin remembered, but still with that boyish face that always seemed to chase approval. Then came Savannah. She wasn't what Calvin expected. Savannah had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head. On the long drive to Redwood State Penitentiary, she had stared at the passing pines, imagining every version of this meeting. The cold silence, the stare down, the awkward handshake. But none of them could quite prepare her for the steel gray eyes that met hers across the visiting room table. She could feel his gaze slicing through her, measuring her posture, her voice, her composure. She smiled not because she felt welcome, but because it was the only armor she had left. She knew who Calvin Briggs was. Tyler had told her stories. And even before that, she'd read between the lines of public records and quiet rumors. A man forged in war, then hardened by prison. A man who saw the world in absolutes, right or wrong, honor or disgrace. And here she was, walking into his line of fire, wearing her truth like a visible target. But Savannah had made a vow to herself long ago. She would never apologize for being who she was. Not in parking lots, not in boardrooms, and not in front of the man who had broken Tyler's childhood. So she smiled, held out her hand, and spoke the words she practiced, steady and sure. "Mr. Briggs, it's really good to finally meet you." But inside, her pulse was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own voice. She was graceful, almost regal in the way she carried herself. Her voice was soft but clear. She offered her hand to Calvin and smiled with genuine warmth. "Mr. Briggs, it's really good to finally meet you." He didn't smile. He nodded, then looked her over quietly. She spoke of her work, her love for Tyler, her plans for the future. She said all the right things. She laughed at Tyler's jokes, spoke respectfully to Calvin, and listened intently when he asked her about her upbringing. But some answers came with hesitation. She said she was from upstate, but gave no town. She mentioned having no real contact with her family anymore. Said it was complicated. Calvin's instincts flared, not because she was rude, but because Savannah had the practiced grace of someone who had worn a mask long enough it had become her skin. And Calvin didn't believe in masks. He believed in scars and what people try to hide, not perfect surfaces. When the visit ended, Tyler hugged his father awkwardly and said he'd write again soon. Savannah smiled politely and added, "I hope we can see each other again, Mr. Briggs." Calvin just stared. As the door shut behind them, a cold knot settled in his gut. He had no idea what it was yet, but something didn't add up. The cell lights buzzed to life at 6 a.m., but Calvin had already been awake for hours. He hadn't slept. Not really. His body might have lain still on the thin mattress, but his mind had been pacing, rewinding every second of that visit. Savannah's laugh, her sidelong glances, her smooth but vague answers. Something gnawed at him. She had dodged nearly every question about her childhood, about her hometown. She was careful, too careful. Calvin told himself he might be paranoid. After all, a woman marrying a man with a father in prison had every right to be cautious. But it wasn't just caution he sensed, it was deflection. And in Calvin's world, deflection meant deception. That morning in the yard, he sat at the far end of a rusted bench and watched the other inmates shuffle through their routines. That's when Reggie Morales dropped beside him, uninvited. Reggie had been at Redwood for nearly as long as Calvin. Sharp-tongued, sly, and always listening. He used to work in medical before he got caught stealing morphine from a clinic. There wasn't much he didn't notice or remember. "So," Reggie said, cracking a sunflower seed between his teeth, "you meet the future daughter-in-law." Calvin didn't look at him. "Yeah, cute girl. Polite. What's the catch?" Calvin gave him a look, then said quietly, "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Reggie raised an eyebrow. "Something's off. She lied about where she's from. Avoided talking about family. It's all too curated." Reggie leaned back. "You ever ask where she went to school?" "She skipped that too," Calvin muttered. Reggie's eyes narrowed, brain clicking through dusty memories. Then he went still. "Wait," he said slowly. "What's her last name again?" "Reed. Savannah Reed." A pause. Reggie blinked. "No way." "What?" "You're not going to like this, Briggs. Back when I worked at the Evergreen Health Clinic, you know, that place in Salem before it shut down, we had a patient. Sean Reed. Came in for hormone therapy. Young, mid-20s. Moved away after a couple years. Kept real quiet. Transgender. The bench seemed to freeze under Calvin. A ringing started in his ears. "You sure?" he said flatly. Reggie nodded. "Positive." Had a unique walk. Voice was soft, like she was trying not to disturb the air. "Same vibe you're describing. I remember her because she always carried around this book about animal care. Said she wanted to work in a clinic." Calvin felt his jaw lock. Something inside him coiled tight. Everything Tyler had said about Savannah working in public health, about her love for animals, matched. So did the silence, the vagueness, the way she looked at Calvin like she knew he was dissecting her and didn't flinch. "You think it's the same person?" Calvin asked, already knowing the answer. Reggie didn't respond. He didn't need to. Back in his cell, Calvin sat rigid on the edge of his bunk, staring at the gray floor. The weight of what he'd heard pressed down on his chest like a steel plate. To him, this wasn't just about gender. It wasn't about identity. It was about betrayal, about his son being dragged into a lie, about being deceived by someone who, in Calvin's mind, had rewritten their past and stolen Tyler's future. The military had trained Calvin to spot threats. Prison had trained him to survive. But neither had prepared him for this. A war he didn't understand. A battle he thought he had already lost. He clenched his fists. "No," he whispered. "Not my boy. Not like this." A few nights later, Calvin sat across from Reggie in the rec room, the television playing some late-night crime show no one was really watching. "You sure you want to go digging?" Reggie asked, voice low. "I need to know everything." Reggie looked around, then leaned in. "I still know a guy. Outside. Owes me a favor. For the right price, he can dig up old records. Medical, legal, name changes, court filings. But it'll cost. I've got commissary. Trade it." Reggie chewed on it, then nodded. "All right. I'll send the word. Give me your full name. Any details you've got." Calvin scribbled on napkin. "Savannah Lynn Reed. Mid-20s. Works public health. Lives near Portland. Engaged to my son." Reggie took the note and slipped it into his shirt like a sacred relic. "Might take a few weeks," he warned. "I've got time," Calvin said. But he didn't really. Not patience-wise. Because now, every moment Savannah remained in his son's life, Calvin saw as time stolen. Time poisoned. Days blurred into nights. Tyler continued writing letters. Cheerful. Full of updates. He talked about renting a small house, picking out wedding colors, Savannah wanting a rescue dog. Calvin read every line like it was a funeral notice. He didn't reply. Sleep became a battlefield. When it came, it brought the same image, Savannah in white beside Tyler, her laughter just out of reach, drowned beneath stained glass silence. Calvin woke each time with his fists clenched and betrayal burning behind his eyes. One night, 2 weeks later, Reggie slid into the dining table across from him and wordlessly pushed over a folded slip of paper. Calvin didn't open it until lights out, beneath the flickering yellow glow of the bulb above his bed. It wasn't long. Just a name, a former one. A county. A court seal. The words, "Legal name change approved. Sean Reed, Savannah Lynn Reed." A silent explosion went off inside him. His breath came shallow. His fingers trembled. Not with fear, but with fury. His instincts had been right. And now, the war inside Calvin Briggs had begun. The next morning, Calvin Briggs sat in the yard staring at nothing. The noise of the prison, metal gates clanging, guards barking, dominoes slapping concrete, faded to a dull hum in the back of his mind. The paper was still in his pocket, crumpled now, but he didn't need to look at it again. He'd read it 10 times the night before, memorized every word. Sean Reed. He whispered the name in his head like it was acid. To Calvin, this wasn't just a detail from someone's past. It was a deception, a deep, personal insult, not just toward him, but toward Tyler, his only son. The one thing he thought he hadn't failed at completely. Now that, too, was slipping through his fingers. She rewrote her story, he muttered, jaw tight. And now she's rewriting his. Calvin didn't speak to Reggie the rest of that week. He didn't go to rec, didn't sign up for mail call. He barely ate. The guards took note. Some thought he was ill. Others assumed it was a temporary mood. No one paid close attention. But inside Calvin's cell, something was building. A pressure. A plan. He began rehearsing scenarios in his mind. What would he say to Tyler? Could he reason with him? Could he expose Savannah and hope Tyler walked away on his own? Each time he played that out in his head, it ended the same. Tyler defending her. Tyler saying, "I knew," or worse, "It doesn't matter." And in Calvin's mind, that would be worse than ignorance. It would mean his son had chosen to believe in a lie. That night, Calvin returned to an old instinct. Not the soldier in him, Not the prisoner, the father. A father, in his eyes, had only one job: to protect his family, at all costs. So he started preparing. The weapon. You couldn't just buy a weapon in prison, but you could make one, or better yet, trade for one. Calvin didn't want anything flashy. A small blade. Something quiet. Something he could hide. He approached Frankie Durham, a young inmate who worked in the kitchen and owed Calvin a debt for stepping into a fight months ago. "I need something sharp. Plastic. Thin. Not metal," Calvin said. Frankie looked at him sideways. "That's risky. They've been doing more random shakedowns lately. I'll cover your next 3 trades. You'll get extra credits in commissary for a month." Frankie hesitated, then nodded. "Give me 2 days." In the staff room that same evening, Officer Deanna Marks poured her 3rd cup of burnt coffee and frowned at the silence in the corner. "Briggs hasn't spoken in 3 days," she muttered to no one in particular. Not even during mail call. Across the table, Officer Patel glanced up from a crossword puzzle. "That's not new. Guy's been a ghost for years." Deanna shook her head. "No, this is different. He's too quiet. Stiff. Like he's coiled up for something." Patel scoffed. "You worried he's going to break out of his supermax with a spoon?" She didn't laugh. Later that night, she logged a note in the incident monitoring system. "Inmate number 038211, Calvin Briggs. Unusual behavioral withdrawal, possible signs of emotional agitation. Recommending psychological observation." The entry sat flagged in the internal system for 48 hours. Unread, unassigned, ignored. By the time anyone noticed, it was far too late. 2 days turned into 4. But eventually, late one evening, Calvin found a rolled-up sock stuffed under his bunk pillow. Inside, a narrow shard of melted plastic, honed to a wicked edge. He turned it slowly in his hand, watching it catch the light. Not perfect, but it would do. The guards rarely searched inmates before visitation. They were more focused on contraband entering from the outside. Calvin tested hiding it at the base of his back, beneath the waistband of his uniform. It lay flat, secure, invisible. The visitation schedule. The next visit was Saturday. Tyler had written in his last letter, "Savannah really wants to see you again, Dad. She said she hopes things can be better this time." He remembered her eyes during the first visit, how they'd met his stare and never wavered, as if she had nothing to hide, as if she belonged there, as if he were the one who needed a change. No, Calvin would not be changed. Not by her. Not by anyone. He reread Tyler's letter and folded it once. Then he tore it slowly down the middle and dropped in the toilet. The last quiet night. On Friday evening, Calvin lay on his bunk and stared at the cracked ceiling, hands folded behind his head. He thought about Tyler as a boy, running in the backyard, falling off a bike, crying into Calvin's chest. He remembered holding him during thunderstorms, teaching him how to tie a fishing knot, buying him his first pocket knife and telling him, "You protect what's yours. You never let anyone take that from you." He hadn't been there when Tyler graduated high school. He'd been inside these same walls, serving a sentence for an act of rage he barely remembered. But this, he remembered clearly. "They already took everything from me," Calvin whispered to the dark. "They won't take him too." He rose from bed at dawn, showered, shaved, folded his sheets military tight, and slipped the blade into his waistband. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. Tomorrow, he told himself, would be the end of it. Saturday morning came colder than usual, with a fog so thick it blurred the edges of the outer fence line. The forest beyond Redwood State Penitentiary disappeared into a wall of gray. Calvin Briggs sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the floor, fully dressed in his prison uniform. The plastic blade was tucked flat against the curve of his lower back, held in place by an elastic band he'd sewn into his waistband. He'd done a final check 3 times. It didn't shift when he walked. It didn't show when he sat. It was silent, deadly, and ready. A guard stopped at his cell. "Briggs, you got a visit." "Yeah," Calvin said, standing slowly. His voice was calm. Too calm. The visiting room was unusually crowded. Dozens of families, couples, and friends filed through security checkpoints. The air buzzed with the faint hum of vending machines and conversation. Table 6, his usual, sat in the far corner by the back wall, partially blocked from view by a support column. Calvin took his seat and waited, hands folded, his expression unreadable. At exactly 2 p.m., they walked in. Tyler looked happy. Too happy. Dressed in a navy sweater, eyes bright with excitement. He waved when he saw his father. Calvin gave a small nod. And beside him, Savannah. She wore a soft gray coat and a warm smile. Her dark hair was pulled into a low braid. Her hand rested lightly on Tyler's arm. Her eyes met Calvin's, calm, composed, confident. Calvin's stomach turned. They reached the table. "Hey, Dad," Tyler said, pulling out a chair. "Hope you don't mind. We brought you some lemon cookies from the vending machine. Savannah remembered you liked those." Calvin stared at the foil-wrapped packet without touching it. "Thoughtful," he said flatly. Savannah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then she sat. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Briggs," she said softly. "Is it?" Tyler glanced between them, trying to keep the tone light. "We've been looking at venues," he said. "There's this place just outside Hood River. By the lake. Quiet. Private. Savannah's in love with it." "Must be nice," Calvin said. "Having that kind of freedom." The words hung there, heavier than the metal table between them. 10 minutes passed. Small talk, mostly driven by Tyler, trying to bridge a gap he didn't know was already collapsing. Then Savannah stood. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I'll be right back." She headed toward the restroom, just beyond the corner of the visitation room. Calvin's eyes followed her. "Dad," Tyler said, suddenly quieter. "Look, I know this isn't easy. I know you've got your own way of seeing things, but Savannah is good. She's honest. She's real. And she loves me." Calvin didn't answer. "I just wanted you to know that. No matter what." There it was, confirmation. He knows. He knows everything, and still chooses her. To Calvin, that was betrayal worse than ignorance. It meant Tyler had not only been fooled, but had accepted the fooling. He stood abruptly. "Just gonna stretch my legs." "Sure," Tyler said, unaware of what was about to unfold. The hallway outside the restroom was quiet, the hum of conversation fading behind him. A guard by the entrance yawned, distracted. The camera above flickered, old, unreliable. A known blind spot. Savannah stood at the sink, adjusting her braid. She caught sight of Calvin in the mirror. Her eyes widened, but not with fear. She thought he was here to talk. "Mr. Briggs." "Don't." Calvin cut her off. She turned to face him fully, the warmth gone from her face now. Only caution remained. "If you come to talk, I'll listen," she said. "But I won't be ashamed of who I am." Calvin stepped closer. "You rewrote yourself. Fine. That's your life. But you rewrote my son. And that's mine. Tyler knows. He's not confused. He's weak," Calvin snapped. "Because of you." "No," she said firmly. "Because of love." He reached behind his back. "You don't get to define love," he whispered. Then he moved. Fast. The blade slid from his waistband like it was born there. Savannah tried to back away, but there was no space. Calvin lunged, the first strike hitting just below her collarbone. She gasped, a choked, wet sound, stumbling against the sink. He struck again, and again. Blood splashed the white tiles like red paint. "Stop," she mouthed, eyes wide in disbelief and terror. But the air was already gone from her lungs. She slid down the wall, crumpling to the floor. A beat of silence, then shouting. A guard's voice echoed from the far end of the hallway. Hey, what the hell?" Calvin turned slowly, the blade slick with blood still in his hand. Calvin didn't resist. He stood frozen, the blood still warm on his hands, his eyes fixed on the fluorescent lights overhead, as if they might offer answers. But all they offered was glare. And for the first time in his life, Calvin wasn't angry. He was hollow. That night, as Calvin sat alone in the concrete silence of solitary, a memory crept in, uninvited, unwelcome. Maya, Tyler's mother. He hadn't thought about her in years, not in any real way. But now, her voice echoed, unbidden, like a soft wind brushing through a locked room. People change, Cal, even when you don't want them to, especially when you don't let them. He remembered the fight they'd had when Tyler turned 16, about college, about independence, about softness. Maya had stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her voice trembling not from fear, but from fury. You want him to be like you, hard, closed off, armored. But he's not, and thank God for that. Back then, Calvin had scoffed, thought she was just emotional, weak. He didn't understand that what she feared wasn't just his anger. It was the legacy he was passing down. Now, sitting in blood-stained silence, he wondered if she had seen all of this coming. If she had known that one day, his protection would become destruction. If her leaving hadn't just been for her, but to save what little softness Tyler had left. Redwood State Penitentiary was placed on full lockdown within 5 minutes of the stabbing. The blaring sirens echoed across the cold concrete walls like a war cry. Guards herded families out of the visitation wing, barking orders while confused children clung to crying mothers. Inmates were slammed against walls, cuffed, counted, and locked away. Inside the hallway, the air had turned sour with blood and ammonia. Savannah Reed's body lay crumpled at the base of the wall, her sweater soaked through with deep red. Her eyes, once vibrant and calm, now stared blankly past the flickering overhead light. Medical staff arrived quickly, but they didn't rush. They didn't have to. She was already gone. Tyler Briggs sat in a holding room, his hands trembling so violently he couldn't hold the paper cup of water someone had offered him. A prison counselor hovered nearby, unsure whether to speak or just sit in silence. She was just, Tyler muttered. She went to the bathroom. That's all. His voice cracked mid-sentence. He turned slowly toward the counselor. He followed her. Didn't he? The counselor didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back in solitary confinement, Calvin Briggs sat on the edge of a cot, staring at the wall. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for anyone. He barely moved. When the guards had dragged him back to his cell, his jumpsuit had been splattered with blood, his hands scraped from the floor, his eyes dull as glass. They tried to question him. Why'd you do it, Briggs? Silence. You just threw away your life. More silence. They eventually stopped trying. The outside world. By Sunday morning, news of the killing had reached every major network in Oregon, and soon the entire country. Transgender woman murdered inside prison during visitation. Killer was Fiancée's father. Brutal hate crime raises alarms about security in Oregon Correctional Facility. Savannah Reed. Her story, her life, her death. Vigils lit up in Portland and Eugene. LGBTQ plus advocacy groups took to the streets with signs that read, "Say her name, Savannah Reed. Prisons are not safe. Justice for Savannah." Calls flooded the governor's office, demanding a full investigation into how a prisoner managed to carry a weapon into a secure visitation area. Meanwhile, the prison warden, Cameron Yates, held a press conference that afternoon. His face was pale, lips tight. "We deeply regret the tragic incident that occurred yesterday. There will be a full internal review. Protocols will be re-examined." But it wasn't enough. Critics slammed the institution for understaffing, broken security cameras, and a failure to identify warning signs in Calvin's behavior. A man with a known history of violence who had been growing increasingly unstable for weeks. The charges. On Monday, Calvin was officially charged with first-degree murder and committing a hate crime within a state facility. He appeared briefly on a video call from the prison, his face blank, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak during arraignment, didn't blink when the judge denied him bail. He simply sat, like the verdict had already been delivered, and in some ways it had. Tyler's hell. For Tyler, the days after the murder blurred together in a storm of grief, anger, and crushing disbelief. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, Savannah, standing in that hallway, the last time he saw her smile. Her favorite coffee mug sat untouched in their kitchen. The wedding invitations they never sent were still in their box, stacked neatly on the living room floor. And his father, the man he'd spent the last year trying to forgive, had become her executioner. At Savannah's funeral, held under gray skies in a small Portland chapel, Tyler spoke softly. "She told me once that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant surviving. And sharing your truth, even when it terrifies people." He paused, voice shaking. Savannah was brave, far braver than the world ever gave her credit for. Her sister, Julia Reed, gripped Tyler's hand the entire service. Later, she would become his anchor in a sea of guilt and isolation. The final letter. A week after the killing, a letter arrived at Tyler's apartment. The envelope had no return address, but he recognized the handwriting instantly. His father. He held it in shaking hands for a full hour before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, with only 2 lines written. I did what I had to do. You were mine before you were hers. Tyler dropped the letter into the sink and lit a match. He didn't watch it burn. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and quiet pressure. It was the first week of March, gray, wind-lashed, and bitter, when the trial of Calvin Briggs officially began. Outside, protesters lined the courthouse steps, their signs flapping violently in the cold. Justice for Savannah Reed. Trans lives matter, even behind prison walls. Hold the system accountable. Camera crews stood elbow to elbow, broadcasting live. The murder inside Redwood had become a national flashpoint, a hate crime, a systemic failure, a father's betrayal turned public tragedy. Inside, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. The accused. Calvin Briggs was led in wearing a beige prison jumpsuit, wrists and ankles shackled. He walked with stiff, mechanical steps, his face emotionless. He didn't glance toward the gallery, didn't acknowledge Tyler, who sat in the front row, spine straight, jaw clenched. For a moment, their eyes almost met. Then Calvin looked away. The prosecution. The lead prosecutor, Angela Ruiz, was a seasoned trial lawyer in her mid-40s, known for her calm ruthlessness and piercing clarity. She stood in front of the jury box and began. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a complicated case. The defendant, Calvin Briggs, waited until his son's fiancée was alone. He followed her into a blind spot within a supposedly secure facility. He brought with him a hidden weapon, and then, with deliberate, hateful intent, he took her life. Savannah Reed was not a threat. She was not armed. She posed no danger. She was a young woman, living her truth in love with the defendant's son. And that truth, that love, is what Calvin Briggs decided to destroy. Her voice softened slightly. This was not an act of confusion. This was not a moment of madness. This was a murder born of ideology, of prejudice. It was cold. It was planned. And it must be answered. The defense. Calvin's court-appointed attorney, Rachel Leonard, stood. She was a slender woman with tired eyes and a file worn soft at the edges. She didn't argue the facts. She couldn't. We do not deny that Mr. Briggs committed the act, she began. The evidence will show that clearly. But what this court must consider is not just what happened, but why. Mr. Briggs is a man who spent over 2 decades in a violent, isolating environment. He suffers from untreated PTSD, deep institutionalization, and distorted perceptions of the outside world. His actions, while horrific, stem from decades of brokenness. She looked toward the jury. We are not asking you to excuse the crime. We are asking you to understand it, and to sentence with humanity, not vengeance. It was a weak hand, and everyone in the room knew it. Witnesses and testimony. Prison guards testified first. One described watching Calvin leave his seat, but admitted he didn't intervene. Another recounted discovering Savannah's body, the weapon beside her. Her voice cracked. A crime scene technician presented photos, grainy hallway surveillance clips, and forensic analysis. The murder weapon, a plastic shard sharpened to a deadly point, was entered into evidence. The jury flinched when the footage was played. They didn't need to see blood. Just Calvin's shadow moving deliberately after Savannah was enough. Tyler takes the stand. The courtroom shifted when Tyler was called. Tyler sat on the cold wooden bench outside the courtroom, hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles ached. The hallway buzzed faintly with footsteps and murmurs, but none of it reached him. He had been called. He knew this moment would come. Standing before a room full of strangers, in front of his father, and saying aloud the things he had only whispered in the dark. In his pocket was a photograph, the same one he kept by his bedside, Savannah in the park, barefoot on a blanket, her eyes half closed in sunlight. She looked peaceful, alive. He squeezed the picture once before returning it to his coat. The bailiff opened the door. "Mr. Briggs, you're up." Tyler rose slowly. Every step to the witness stand felt like trudging through water. As he passed his father's chair, he didn't look down. Couldn't. Not because of hate, but because the man sitting there no longer resembled the one he had once called Dad. This wasn't justice, Tyler thought. This was anatomy, dissecting the ruins of a love story neither of them had the tools to fix. He walked to the stand in a black suit, his eyes sunken, face pale but resolute. He took the oath with trembling hands. Prosecutor Ruiz approached gently. "Tyler, can you tell us who Savannah was to you?" He exhaled, voice cracking slightly. "She was my best friend, my partner, the first person who really saw me, all of me, and stayed." "When did she tell you about her past?" "On our third date," he said quietly. "She didn't hide it. She was scared, but she was honest." "And how did your father respond when you told him?" Tyler shook his head. "I didn't tell him. I was afraid of what he'd say, of what he'd do. Guess I had reason." The gallery was silent. "Did Savannah ever express fear of your father?" "No," Tyler said, eyes glistening. She wanted him to accept us. She believed in second chances, even for him." Ruiz's final question hung heavy. "How has her death affected you?" Tyler's voice broke. "She was my future. Now I wake up and the world's quiet and broken. And no matter what happens to him," he gestured toward his father, "I don't get her back." Cross-examination. Rachel Leonard approached Tyler with care. She asked about Calvin's childhood, about his years in the military, about Tyler's attempts to reconnect. But she didn't challenge him. She couldn't. When Tyler stepped down, he didn't look at his father. Calvin stared straight ahead. Public response. Each day after court, reporters waited like vultures. Tyler never spoke to them. But Savannah's sister, Julia, did. Savannah wasn't just a victim, she said into a wall of microphones. She was a woman full of love, full of hope, and she deserved to grow old. Online, the conversation exploded. Hashtags like hashtag justice for Savannah and hashtag trans lives are human lives trended for days. Some tried to paint Calvin as a tragic figure. But the truth, as one op-ed put it, was sharper than pity. He didn't snap. He planned. And what he destroyed wasn't just a life. It was a future. The verdict draws near. The trial lasted just over 6 days. The defense called no expert witnesses. No psychiatric evaluations were admitted. Calvin refused to testify. "There's nothing I want to say," he told his lawyer. "There's plenty you should," she replied. But he stayed silent. When closing arguments were given, Angela Ruiz's final words echoed across the hushed courtroom. He thought this crime would reclaim his son. Instead, he lost him forever. Let that be the weight of his sentence. The jury retired to deliberate. Tyler sat outside the courtroom beside Julia, gripping a photo of Savannah in her favorite yellow sundress. He hadn't spoken in hours. Inside, 12 strangers carried the final word. The only justice left was the kind that could still speak for Savannah Reed. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. Tension thickened in the courtroom like fog on a battlefield. Reporters filled the wooden benches with notebooks poised. Protesters outside the courthouse grew louder with each hour that passed. Security was doubled. Metal detectors beeped endlessly. Inside the courthouse, Tyler Briggs sat in silence, staring straight ahead, a framed photo of Savannah resting in his lap. He hadn't eaten since the night before. Sleep had come in fragments, if at all. He didn't pray for vengeance. He didn't pray at all. He just wanted the world to finally say, out loud, that what happened mattered. The return. On the second day, just before noon, the jury returned. Everyone rose as Judge Karen Holloway entered, a tall, silver-haired woman known for her composure. Her gaze swept the room once before she nodded at the bailiff. "Bring in the jury." 12 people filed in, faces unreadable. Not a glance at the gallery. Not a glance at Calvin. The judge turned to the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with nervous hands. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Please read it." The courtroom went still. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Calvin Briggs, guilty of murder in the first degree." There was a brief inhale across the room, a vacuum of breath, and then silence again. Tyler's eyes welled, but he did not cry. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something already known in his bones. Calvin didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stood there, shackled, unmoved. He was already gone. Sentencing. Judge Holloway did not delay. Sentencing was scheduled for the next morning, and she made it clear. This court will not prolong the pain inflicted on the victim's family. Justice must be swift. The next day, the courtroom was quieter. There were fewer cameras, fewer gasps, no opening statements. Just one man's final reckoning. Calvin was led in once more. Same jumpsuit, same dead stare. Judge Holloway addressed him directly. Mr. Briggs, this court finds no justification for your actions. You extinguished a life, violated a space meant for connection, and shattered what remained of your own family. The murder of Savannah Reed was deliberate, hateful, and irrevocable. You will serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. She paused, then added, You have destroyed more than one life, and you have done it in full awareness of what it meant. The gavel struck. Calvin blinked for the first time. After the verdict, outside the courthouse, Julia Reed stood with Tyler before a row of microphones. She read a prepared statement. Savannah was a daughter, a sister, a fiancée, a healer. She was not a symbol. She was not a statement. She was a person. Tyler took over. This verdict doesn't bring her back, but it tells the world that her life had weight, that she deserved to live. And no matter what my father believed, love is not a lie. Savannah was real, and so is the grief. He stepped away before questions began. He had said what mattered. In the cell, back at Redwood, Calvin was transferred permanently to isolation. The guards didn't speak to him, not because they were ordered not to, but because there was nothing left to say. He sat in a small cement box. No window, no view, just a slot in the door and the sound of his own breath. His court file remained open on the desk in the warden's office, a red-stamped verdict page resting on top. Guilty, life without parole. The prison psychologist attempted one final interview before he was assigned to permanent solitary housing. Do you understand your sentence, Mr. Briggs? Calvin stared at the floor. It doesn't matter anymore. Why did you do it? Because he was mine, and she took him from me. For Tyler, the wound remains. Weeks later, Tyler visited Savannah's favorite park, a quiet place overlooking a lake where they had once planned to hold their wedding. He sat on the same bench, the photo of her in his hands. You were right, he whispered. The truth matters. He didn't cry this time. The grief hadn't faded. It had simply settled, like something too large to carry, but too important to let go. He stood up, tucked the photo into his coat, and walked toward the edge of the lake. There was no music, no triumph, just wind through the trees and the sound of someone trying, one day at a time, to live again. Months passed. The headlines faded. The protests quieted. Cameras turned elsewhere. But for Tyler Briggs, time did not heal. It only rearranged the wreckage. His days were mechanical. Coffee left untouched. Wedding photos never framed. The apartment still had Savannah's books on the shelf, her favorite sweatshirt folded neatly on the arm of the couch. Sometimes, Tyler caught himself reaching for his phone to text her. And then he remembered. Again, he tried therapy. It helped in fragments. He wrote letters to Savannah, sometimes long, sometimes only a single sentence. I saw a woman today who looked like you. I almost smiled. I still don't forgive him. I miss you most in silence. He never reread the letters. He just placed them in a box, locked it, and slid it under the bed. The letter that changed everything. One afternoon, a letter arrived from an advocacy group called Stone Circle, focused on protecting trans individuals in high-risk environments, particularly within the prison system. They had followed Savannah's case. They want to know if Tyler would speak at a panel, not about the crime, but about Savannah, about who she was, about what the world had lost. Tyler sat at his kitchen table for hours, staring at the invitation. Then, finally, he picked up a pen and wrote one word. Yes, the first speech. It was a small community center in Eugene. Nothing fancy. Folding chairs. A single microphone on a plastic podium. Tyler stood before a crowd of 50 people. His palms were sweating. His heart thudded in his ears. He looked down at his prepared notes, then back at the crowd, and for the first time, he told her story. Savannah was more than a victim. She was more than a name on a court docket or a protest sign. She was a woman who fought for others, who forgave too easily, who believed in people, including the one who killed her. When Tyler stepped down from the podium, the room remained hushed for several seconds, not from apathy, but from weight. Real, heavy silence, the kind that meant people were still absorbing every word. Then someone stood and clapped. Slowly, deliberately. Another followed, then another. By the time Tyler reached the back of the room, the applause had swelled, not wild or loud, but persistent, like steady rain on a rooftop. A kind of quiet thunder. Respectful, grieving, affirming. An older woman approached him in the hallway afterward, eyes glassy behind thick glasses. "My niece is trans," she whispered. "She's afraid all the time. But hearing you gave me hope she won't always have to be." Tyler didn't have the words to reply. He just nodded gently and squeezed her hand. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he opened the small wooden box under his bed, the one where he had kept all the unsent letters to Savannah. For the first time, he pulled one out and read it aloud. "I'm still afraid, but I think maybe you left me enough courage to keep going." He folded the letter back and whispered, "Thank you. We can't bring her back, but we can decide what happens next." The room was silent. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. A new purpose. From that day on, Tyler became a voice, not a loud one, but a steady one. He met with lawmakers to advocate for better visitation protocols inside prisons, mandatory security reviews, and mental health screenings for long-term inmates. He spoke at high schools and colleges, told young people about Savannah, about love, about danger, about truth. Some nights, after long days of speaking, he came home, sat on the couch, and whispered, "I hope you're proud of me." The silence didn't answer, but it didn't hurt quite as much. Reunions and rebuilding. Julia Reed, Savannah's sister, remained his closest companion. Over time, they built something between friendship and shared grief. She pushed him to keep moving. He pushed her to stay grounded. Together, they helped establish the Savannah Reed Foundation, aimed at providing legal aid to LGBTQ+ individuals in vulnerable systems, especially prisons. The foundation's slogan, chosen by Tyler, was simple: "Truth deserves protection." 1 year after the foundation's launch, Tyler received a handwritten letter from a corrections officer in a small women's facility near Bakersfield, California. It was simple, short, but heavy. "There's an inmate here, 18 years old, transgender. Her bunkmate's been threatening her since she arrived. I've reported it twice. Nothing's changed. I saw what happened in Oregon. I'm scared it's going to happen here too. Please help." Tyler and Julia acted immediately. Within days, the foundation's legal team filed an emergency injunction. Media outlets were notified. The warden received a direct letter from a state senator who had partnered with the foundation 6 months prior. By the end of the week, the inmate had been transferred to a protected housing unit. Her name was Daniela, and she lived. When Tyler got the news, he didn't smile. He exhaled, long and slow, and looked at the plaque on his desk that bore Savannah's name. "She would have done the same," he murmured. And for the first time, the weight of legacy didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. The final visit. A year after the verdict, Tyler received a notice. Calvin had been transferred to a long-term isolation block with declining health. He hadn't requested a visit, but Tyler went anyway. He walked the long, cold hallway of Redwood one last time. He was led into a sealed visitation booth, separated by thick glass. A phone sat between them. Calvin entered slowly. Older, grayer, thinner. He sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Tyler picked up the phone. "You'll never be free again," he said quietly. "But I came here to say one thing. Not for you, for me." Calvin blinked, waiting. "You didn't win." He stood up, hung up the phone, walked out. He never returned. The sunset bench. 2 years after Savannah's death, Tyler visited the lake where they had once planned to get married. He sat on the same bench, this time with a new plaque installed. In memory of Savannah Reed. She lived truthfully. She loved fiercely. He ran his fingers over the words. Then he sat in silence. The wind stirred through the trees. The lake shimmered with golden light. Somewhere behind him, 2 children laughed. And for the first time in a long time, Tyler closed his eyes and smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because her legacy lived on. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the foundation's post office box. It bore no return address, just a Portland postmark. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, handwritten in looping cursive. Dear Tyler, I don't know you, and you don't know me, but you knew Savannah, and because of that, you've changed my life. I'm 17. I've never told anyone who I really am. But watching you speak, reading about what you built, it gave me courage I didn't think I had. Yesterday, I told my mom the truth. She cried. Then she hugged me. I thought you should know. Somewhere out there, someone survived because of what you lost. Thank you. A kid trying to be brave. Tyler folded the letter slowly, gently, and placed it beside Savannah's photo on the windowsill. The lake outside shimmered in the late afternoon sun. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some truths don't need an answer, only a witness.